don't shout at me because I'm not a sociable person. I'm not a person that I did not deal with people all my life. So if you shout to me, I immediately take it as an insult.
Equal to the weight of portions of water paired with hydrogen of the bulks I have represented in these spheres. And its illustration
renders evident forces previously tranquil.
Baseball is America's pastime.
it is
Section 0 of On the Various Forces of Nature. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. On the Various Forces of Nature by Michael Faraday. Preface. Which was first, matter or force? If we think on this question, we shall find that we are unable to conceive of matter without force, or of force without matter. When God created the elements of which the earth is composed, He created certain wondrous forces which are set free and become evident when matter acts on matter. All of these forces, with many differences, have much in common, and if one is set free, it will immediately endeavor to free its companions. Thus, heat will enable us to eliminate light, electricity, magnetism, and chemical action. Chemical action will induce light, electricity, and heat. In this way, we find that all the forces in nature tend to form mutually dependent systems, and as the motion of one star affects another, so force in action liberates and renders evident forces previously tranquil. We say tranquil, and yet the word is almost without meaning in the cosmos. Where do we find tranquility? The sea, the seat of animal, vegetable, and mineral changes, is at war with the earth, and the air lends itself to the strife. The globe, the scene of perpetual intestine change, is as a mass acting on and acted on by the other planets of our system, and the very system itself is changing its place in space under the influence of a known force springing from an unknown center. For many years, the English public had the privilege of listening to the discourses and speculations of Professor Faraday at the Royal Institution on matter and forces, and it is not too much to say that no lecture on physical science since the time of Sir Humphrey Davy was ever listened to with more delight. The pleasure which all derived from the expositions of Faraday was of a somewhat different kind from that produced by any other philosopher whose lectures we have attended. It was partially derived from his extreme dexterity as an operator. With him, we had no chance of apologies for
Part 1 of Which of the Demon Sees. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Schonebert. Witch of the Demon Seas by Poole Anderson. This story was first published in Planet Stories, January 1951. Part 1. Crowman the Conqueror, Thalassocrat of Akera, stood watching his guards bring up the captured pirates. He was a huge man, his hair and square-cut beard jet black despite middle age. The strength of his warlike youth still in his powerful limbs. He wore a plain white tunic and purple-trimmed cloak. The only sign of kingship was the golden chaplet on his head and the signet ring on one finger. In the gaudy crowd of slender, chattering courtiers, he stood out with a brutal contrast. "So they finally captured him," he rumbled. "So we're finally rid of Corun and the seagoing bandits. Maybe now the land will have some peace." "What will you do with him, sire?" asked Chorzon the sorcerer. Crowman shrugged heavy shoulders. "I don't know. Pirates are usually fed to the Irines at the games, I suppose, but Corun deserves something special." "Public torture, perhaps, sire? It could be stretched over many days." "No, you fool. Corun was the bravest enemy Akera ever had. He deserves an honorable death and a decent tomb. Not that it matters much, but..." Chorzon exchanged a glance with Caresis, then looked back toward the approaching procession. The city Taurus was built around a semicircular bay, a huge expanse of clear green water on whose surface floated ships from halfway round the world. The greatest harbor for none knew how many empty sea leagues. Capital of Akera, which with its trade and its empire of entire archipelagos was the mightiest of the thalassocracies. Beyond the fortified sea walls at the end of the bay, the ocean swelled mightily to the clouded horizon, gray and green and amber. Within, the hulls and sails of ships were a bright confusion up to the stone docks. The land ran upward from the bay, and Taurus was built on the hills, a tangle of streets between houses that ranged from the clay huts of the poor to the marble villas of the great. Beyond the city walls on the landward side,
an unsuccessful experiment, no hanging fire in the midst of a series of brilliant demonstrations of producing that depressing tendency akin to the pain felt by an audience at a false note from a vocalist. All was a sparkling stream of eloquence and experimental illustration. We would have defied a chemist loving his science, no matter how often he might himself have repeated an experiment, to feel uninterested when seen it done by Faraday. The present publication presents one or two points of interest. In the first place, the lectures were especially intended for young persons, and are therefore as free as possible from technicalities. And in the second place, they are printed as they were spoken, verbatim et liberatim. A careful and skillful reporter took them down, and the manuscript, as deciphered from his notes, was subsequently most carefully corrected by the editor as regards any scientific points which were not clear to the shorthand writer. Hence, all that is different arises solely from the impossibility, alas, of conveying the manner as well as the matter of the lecture. May the readers of these lectures derive 1/10 of the pleasure and instruction from their perusal which they gave to those who had the happiness of hearing them. Signed, W. Brooks. End of section 0. Section 1 of On the Various Forces of Nature by Michael Faraday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Various Forces of Nature by Michael Faraday. Lecture 1, The Force of Gravitation, Part 1. It grieves me much to think that I may have been cause of disturbance in your Christmas arrangements, for nothing is more satisfactory to my mind than to perform what I undertake. But such things are not always left in our own power, and we must submit to circumstances as they are appointed. I will today do my best, and will ask you to bear with me if I am unable to give more than a few words. As a substitute, I will endeavor to make illustrations of this sense I try to express as full as possible. And if we find by the end of this lecture that we may be justified in continuing them, thinking that next week our power shall be greater, why then, with submission to you, we will take such course as you may think fit, either to go on or to discontinue them. And, although I now feel much weakened by the pressure of illness, a mere cold, upon me, both in facility of expression and clearness of thought, I shall here claim, as I always have done on these occasions, the right of addressing myself to the young members of the audience. And for this purpose, therefore, unfitted as it may seem for an elderly, infirm man to do so, I will return to second childhood and become, as it were, young again amongst the young. Let us now consider for a little while how wonderfully we stand upon the world. Here it is we are born, bred, and live, and yet we view these things with an almost entire absence of wonder to ourselves respecting the way in which all this happens. So small indeed is our wonder that we are never taken by surprise. And I do think that to a young person of 10, 15, or 20 years of age, perhaps the first sight of a cataract or a mountain would occasion him more surprise than he had ever felt concerning the means of his own existence, how he came here, how he lives, by what means he stands upright, and through what means he moves about from place to place. Hence, we come into this world, we live and depart from it without our thoughts being called specifically to consider how this all takes place. And were it not for the exertions of some few inquiring minds who have looked into these things and ascertained the very beautiful laws and conditions by which we do live and stand upon the earth, we should hardly be aware that there was anything wonderful in it. In these inquiries, which have occupied philosophers from the earliest days, when they first began to find out the laws by which we grow and exist and enjoy ourselves up to the present time, have shown us that all this was effected in consequence of the existence of certain forces or abilities to do things, or powers that are so common that nothing can be more so. For nothing is commoner than the wonderful powers by which we are enabled to stand upright. They are essential to our existence every moment. It is my purpose today to make you acquainted with some of these powers, not the vital ones, but some of the more elementary and what we call physical powers. And in the outset, what can I do to bring to your minds a notion of neither more nor less than that which I mean by the word power or force? Suppose I take this sheet of paper and place it upright on one edge, resting against a support before me, as the roughest possible illustration of something to be disturbed. And suppose I then pull this piece of string which is attached to it. I pull the paper over, and I have therefore brought into use a power of doing so. The power of my hand carried on through the string in a way which is very remarkable when we come to analyze it. And it is by means of these powers conjointly, for there are several powers here employed, that I pull the paper over. Again, if I give it a push upon the other side, I bring into play a power, but a different exertion of power from the former. Or if I take now this bit of shellac, a stick of shellac about 12 inches long and 1 in diameter, and rub it with flannel, and hold it an inch or so in front of the upper part of this upright sheet, the paper is immediately moved toward the shellac. And by now drawing the latter away, the paper falls over without having been touched by anything. You see, in the first illustration, I produced an effect than which nothing could be commoner. I pull it over now, not by means of that string or the pull of my hand, but by some action in the shellac. The shellac, therefore, has a power wherewith it acts upon the sheet of paper. And as an illustration of the exercise of another kind of power, I might use gunpowder with which to throw it over. Now, I want you to endeavor to comprehend that when I am speaking of a power or force, I am speaking of that which I used just now to pull over this piece of paper. I will not embarrass you at present with the name of that power, but it is clear there was a something in the shellac which acted by attraction and pulled the paper over. This then is one of those things which we call power or force, and you will now be able to recognize it as such in whatever form I show it to you. We are not to suppose that there are so very many different powers. On the contrary, it is wonderful to think of how few are the powers by which all the phenomena of nature are governed. There is an illustration of another kind of power in that lamp. There is a power of heat, a power of doing something, but not the same power as that which pulled the paper over. And so by degrees we find that there are certain other powers, not many, in the various bodies around us. And thus, beginning with the simplest experiments of pushing and pulling, I shall gradually proceed to distinguish these powers one from the other and compare the way in which they combine together. This world upon which we stand, and we have not much need to travel out of the world for illustrations of our subject, but the mind of man is not confined like the matter of his body, and thus he may and does travel outwards, for wherever his sight can pierce, there his observations can penetrate. It's pretty nearly a round globe, having its surface disposed in a manner of which this terrestrial globe by my side is a rough model. So much is land and so much is water, and by looking at it here, we see in a sort of map or picture how the world is formed upon its surface. Then, when we come to examine it further, I refer you to this sectional diagram of the geological strata of the Earth, in which there is a more elaborate view of what is beneath the surface of our globe. And when we come to dig into or examine it, as man does for his own instruction and advantage in various of ways, we see that it is made up of different kinds of matter, subject to a very few powers, and all disposed in a strange and wonderful way, which gives to man a history, and such a history as to what there is in these veins, in these rocks, the ores, the water springs, the atmosphere around, and all the varieties of material substances held together by means of forces in one great mass, 8,000 miles in diameter, that the mind is overwhelmed in contemplation of the wonderful history related by these strata, some of which are fine and thin like sheets of paper, all formed in succession by the forces of which I have spoken. I now shall try to help your attention to what I may say by directing today our thoughts to one kind of power. You see what I mean by the term matter, any of these things that I can lay hold of with the hand, or a bag, for I may take hold of the air by enclosing it in a bag. They are all portions of matter with which we have to deal at present, generally or particularly as I may require to illustrate my point. Here is the sort of matter which we call water. It is there, ice, pointing to a block of ice upon the table. There, water, pointing to the water boiling in a flask. There, vapor, you see issuing out from the top of the flask. Do not suppose that ice and that water are two entirely different things, or that the steam rising in bubbles and ascending in vapor there is absolutely different from the fluid water. It may be different in some particulars, having reference to the amounts of power which it contains, but it is the same, nevertheless, as the great ocean of water around our globe, and I employ it here for the sake of illustration, because if we look into it, we shall find that it supplies us with examples of all the powers to which I have to refer. For instance, here is water. It is heavy, but let us examine it with regard to the amount of its heaviness or its gravity. I have before me a little glass vessel and scales, nearly equipoised scales, one of which contained a half-pint glass vessel, and the glass vessel is at present the lighter of the two. Now if I take some water and pour it in, you see that the side of the scales immediately goes down. That shows you, using common language, which I will not suppose for the present you have hitherto applied very strictly, that is heavy. And if I put this additional weight into the opposite scale, I should not wonder if this vessel would hold water enough to weigh it down. The lecturer poured some more water into the jar, which again went down. Why do I hold the bottle above the vessel to pour the water into it? You will say because experience has taught me that it is necessary I do it for a better reason, because it is a law of nature that the water should fall toward the earth, and therefore the very means which I use to cause the water to enter the vessel are those which will carry the whole body of water down. That power is what we call gravity, and you see there, pointing to the scales, a good deal of water gravitating toward the earth. Now here, exhibiting a small piece of platinum, is another thing which gravitates toward the earth as much as the whole of that water. See what a little there is of it. That little thing is heavier than so much water. Placing the metal in opposite scales to the water, what a wonderful thing it is to see that it requires so much water as that, a half-pint vessel full, to fall toward the earth compared with the little mass of substance I have here. And again, if I take this metal, a bar of aluminum about 8 times the bulk of the platinum, we find that the water will balance that as well as it did the platinum. So that we get, even in the very outset, an example of what we went to understand by the words forces and powers. I have spoken of water, and first of all, of its property of falling downwards. You know very well how the oceans surround the globe, how they fall around the surface, giving roundness to it, clothing it like a garment. But besides that, there are other properties of water. Here, for instance, is some quicklime, and if I add some water to it, you will find another power of property in the water. It is now very hot. It is steaming up, and I could perhaps light a phosphorus or a lucifer match with it. Now, that could not happen without a force in the water to produce the result. But that force is entirely distinct from its power of falling to the earth. Again, here is another substance, some anhydrous sulfate of copper, which will illustrate another kind of power. The lecturer here poured some water over the white sulfate of copper, which immediately became blue, evolving considerable heat at the same time. Here is the same water with a substance which heats nearly as much as the lime does, but see how differently. So great indeed is this heat in the case of lime that it is sufficient sometimes, as you see here, to set wood on fire. And this explains what we have sometimes heard of, barges laden with quicklime taking fire in the middle of the river in consequence of this power of heat brought into play by a leakage of the water into the barge. You see how strangely different subjects for our consideration arise. When we come to think over these various matters, the power of heat evolved by acting upon lime with water, and the power which water has of turning this salt of copper from white to blue. Now I want you to understand the nature of the most simple exertion of this power of matter called weight or gravity. Bodies are heavy. You saw that in the case of the water when I placed it in the balance. Here I have what we call a weight, an iron half hundredweight, a thing called a weight, because in it the exercise of that power of pressing downward is especially used for the purpose of weighing. And I have also one of these little inflated India rubber bladders, which are very beautiful, although very common. Most beautiful things are common. And I'm going to put the weight upon it to give you a sort of illustration of the downward pressure of the iron and of the power which the air possesses of resisting that pressure. It may burst, but we must try to avoid that. During the last few observations, the lecturer has succeeded in placing the half hundredweight in a state of quiescence upon the inflated India rubber ball, which consequently assumed a shape very much resembling a flat cheese with rounded edges. There you see a bubble of air bearing half a hundredweight, and you must conceive for yourselves what a wonderful power there must be to pull this weight downwards, to sink it thus in the ball of air. End of section 1. Section 2 of On the Various Forces of Nature by Michael Faraday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. On the Various Forces of Nature by Michael Faraday. Lecture 1, The Force of Gravitation, Part 2. Let me now give you another illustration of this power. You know what a pendulum is. I have one here, figure 1. And if I set it swinging, it will continue to swing to and fro. Now, I wonder whether you can tell me why that body oscillates to and fro, that pendulum bob, as it is sometimes called. Observe, if I hold the straight stick horizontally, as high as the position of the balls at the two ends of its journey, you see that the ball is in a higher position at the two extremities than it is when in the middle. Starting from one end of the stick, the ball falls toward the center, and then rising again to the opposite end, it constantly tries to fall to the lowest point, swinging and vibrating most beautifully, and with wonderful properties in other respects, the time of its vibration, and so on, but concerning which we will not now trouble ourselves. If a gold leaf, or a piece of thread, or any other substance were hung where this ball is, it would swing to and fro in the same manner, and in the same time too. Do not be startled at this statement. I repeat, in the same manner and in the same time. And you will see by and by how this is. Now, that power which caused the water to descend in the balance, which made the iron weight press upon and flatten the bubble of air, which caused the swinging to and fro of the pendulum, that power is entirely due to the attraction which there is between the falling body and the earth. Let us be slow and careful to comprehend this. It is not that the earth has any particular attraction toward the bodies which fall to it, but that all these bodies possess an attraction, every one towards the other. It is not that the earth has any special power which these balls themselves have not, for just as much power as the earth has to attract these two balls, dropping two ivory balls, just so much power have they in proportion to their bulks to draw themselves one to the other. And the only reason why they fall so quickly to the earth is owing to its greater size. Now, if I were to place these two balls near together, I should not be able, by the most delicate arrangement of apparatus, to make you or myself sensible that these balls did attract one another. And yet we know that such is the case. Because if instead of taking a small ivory ball, we take a mountain and put a ball like this near it, we will find that, owing to the vast size of the mountain as compared with the billiard ball, the latter is drawn slightly toward it, showing clearly that an attraction does exist, just as it did between the shellac which I rubbed and the piece of paper which was overturned by it. Now, it is not very easy to make these things quite clear at the outset, and I must take care not to leave anything unexplained as I proceed. And therefore, I must make you clearly understand that all bodies are attracted to the earth, or to use a more learned term, gravitate. You will not mind my using this word, for when I say that this penny piece gravitates, I mean nothing more nor less than it falls toward the earth. And if not intercepted, it would go on falling until it arrived at what we call the center of gravity of the earth, which I will explain to you by and by. I want you to understand that this property of gravitation is never lost, that every substance possesses it, that there is never any change in the quantity of it, and first of all, I will take as illustration a piece of marble. Now this marble has weight, as you will see if I put it on these scales. It weighs the balance down, and if I take it off, the balance goes back again and resumes its equilibrium. I can decompose this marble and change it in the same manner as I can change ice into water and water into steam. I can convert a part of it into its own steam easily and show you that this steam from the marble has the property of remaining in the same place at common temperatures, which water steam has not. If I add a little liquid to the marble and decompose it, I get that which you see. The lecturer here put several lumps of marble into a glass jar and poured water and then acid over them. The carbonic acid immediately commenced to escape with considerable effervescence. The appearance of boiling, which is only the separation of one part of the marble from another. Now this marble steam and that water steam and all other steams gravitate just like any other substance does. They are all attracted the one towards the other and all fall towards the earth. And what I want you to see is that this steam gravitates. I have here, figure 2, a large vessel placed upon a balance. And the moment I pour this steam into it,